Hello everyone, I'm Emma Whipday. Welcome to At Home with Austen for A Bit Lit. The At Home with Austen series explores how the structures of the home, the spaces of the home, relationships within the home, and ideas about the home shape Austen's fiction. And today, in video number 5 of this series, I'm going to be exploring something that, if you're anything like me, you'll have been doing a lot of in 2020, and that is staying in, with the Austen heroine who perhaps stays in the most and who also finds her love story shaped by the necessity for staying in, and that is Emma Woodhouse in Austen's Emma. But before I begin, I'm going to remove my bonnet because Austen heroines don't wear bonnets when they're staying in. So I want to start by discussing Emma in relation to the famous first sentence of the novel, which begins, "Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world, with very little to distress or vex her." Now, this sentence at first glance seems like something an omniscient, all-knowing, third-person narrator is saying about Emma, that she's handsome and therefore in a privileged position when it comes to the marriage market in this period as a beautiful woman, that she's clever, and we learn in the novel as we read that she certainly thinks herself clever, and that she's rich, which again puts her in a very secure and privileged position, particularly because she doesn't have the economic necessity for marriage that many Austen heroines have. We learn about this comfortable home, which I'm going to suggest becomes more and more important as the novel goes on, as well as her happy disposition. And we learn, as I said, that she's lived 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. Except, has she? Because the narrator very soon tells us that Emma's mother died a few years ago. And so we get the sense that this lack of distress or vexation isn't true, that she has a lot of distress in her past, that she has grief and pain in her past. And this hints to us that actually this isn't solely the narrator's view of Emma, that actually what's happening here is something that's known as free indirect discourse. And that's a literary technique where the thoughts of the character creep in to the language of what seems to be a third-person narrator. So although the narrator tells us this, it's actually how Emma thinks about herself. Her way of protecting herself from pain is to think about herself as secure and happy and having very little distress or vexation in her past. And we can see this in how she thinks about her home as well. So, for example, in chapter 10, when Harriet Smith is surprised that Emma doesn't seem to wish to marry, Emma responds, "I have none of the usual inducements of women to marry. I believe few married women are half as much mistress of their husband's house as I am of Hartfield, and never, never could I expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first and always right, in any man's eyes, as I am in my father's." And there are some lovely points here, and some true points. There's her very real affection for her father that we see throughout the novel, and there's the fact that in a patriarchal society, she is indeed much freer with an indulgent and inactive father as an active young woman able to manage her household than she would be as a wife to a husband. In a world before the Married Women's Property Act, she would lose everything on marrying her husband and it would all belong to him. So it makes sense that she'd desire to continue her current independence at Hartfield, her comfortable home. But there's also something unspoken here that becomes clear even in the first chapter of the novel, and that is, although Emma is very much mistress of Hartfield, where she lives with her father, she's also very much circumscribed by Hartfield. You could even say trapped or imprisoned by Hartfield, because there's a limit to how far beyond it she can go. And we get a sense of this when we learn about her sister. In chapter 1 we read, "Her sister, though comparatively but little removed by matrimony, being settled in London, only 16 miles off, was much beyond her daily reach, and many a long October and November evening must be struggled through at Hartfield, before Christmas brought the next visit from Isabella and her husband, and their little children, to fill the house, and give her pleasant society again." Of course, the novel opens with Miss Taylor, Emma's governess, having been just married to Mr. Weston and therefore removing to another house. And we get the sense in this sentence by the line to fill the house, that she needs Isabella and the husband and children to come and fill the house, just how empty the house is without them, and the idea that although it's a comfortable home, it's also a lonely one, and one she can't readily leave. We learn her sister is only 16 miles off, but there's no suggestion that she is able to leave her father to go and visit her sister and be in London. Even though London's only 16 miles away, she's entirely at the mercy of when people from London choose to come and visit her. And we very much get that sense in the first chapter when we hear that Mr. Woodhouse is bemoaning the loss of the governess, Miss Taylor, and talking about how sad it is that she's gone away to marry. And he says, "Poor Miss Taylor, I wish she were here again. What a pity it is that Mr. Weston ever thought of her." And Emma answers, "I cannot agree with you, Papa. You know I cannot. Mr. Weston is such a good-humoured, pleasant, excellent man that he thoroughly deserves a good wife. And you would not have had Miss Taylor live with us forever and bear all my odd humours when she might have had a house of her own." And that's really significant, that sense of the distinction between being subservient and a dependent in someone else's house and having your own home, which we have to remember not everyone in the novel does. For example, both Harriet Smith and Jane Fairfax are essentially peripatetic, relying on the hospitality of others. But Mr. Woodhouse, in his privileged position, doesn't understand this. He responds, "A house of her own? But where is the advantage of a house of her own? This is 3 times as large, and you never have any odd humours, my dear." So the suggestion there that the size of the house might compensate for the fact that it isn't your house is something that comes up later, but reverse the question of whether you'd be happy in your own home if it were only a small one. So Austen is repeatedly sort of pushing in this novel at questions about what makes a home and what makes it comfortable. Is it size, or does it just need to be yours? And Emma tries to comfort him by saying, "How often we shall be going to see them, and they coming to see us. We shall be always meeting. We must begin. We must go and pay a wedding visit very soon." And he answers, "My dear, how am I to get so far? Randalls is such a distance. I could not walk half so far." And she responds, "No, Papa, nobody thought of your walking. We must go in the carriage, to be sure." So again, we get that sense of distance being such a barrier to Emma and to her father. The fact that even though Randalls is nearby, if she wants to visit it with her father, a carriage is required. And there's that sense again of Hartfield's isolation, of how cut off it is from the society of the outside world, unless people are willing to come to it. And this is something that also comes up when Emma's sister and her family finally visit. And we get a suggestion that the world is so much larger than the boundaries of Hartfield, where Emma's imagination is so often forced to stop. So in the conversation, Emma says, "Come, come, I must beg you not to talk of the sea. It makes me envious and miserable. I, who have never seen it." And John Mullen, in his excellent book, What Matters in Jane Austen, writes that this is telling us something essential about Emma. All-powerful in Highbury, but incapable of reaching out beyond it. Fearless in her little world, but timid about what might lie outside its closely hemmed borders. By a carefully managed irony, however, she cannot escape the seaside. She is the unknowing witness, even the abettor, of an amorous relationship that was born at the seaside. And this is, as those of you familiar with the novel will know, the secret engagement between Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax that took place at Weymouth at the seaside. And so there's this sense that Jane Fairfax, who's someone that Emma pities a little perhaps, but also dislikes and finds dull and reserved, actually has far wider horizons than Emma. She's travelled, she's seen the sea, and she's had a love affair, a secret engagement. So even though Emma seems all-powerful and very privileged in her little world, and has the security of a home in the way that Jane Fairfax does not, in fact the security of the home is one of the things that stops Emma from being able to broaden her experiences. But it's not just Emma's home that we get a sense of in the novel. Another home that's repeatedly referred to is that of Mr. Elton, and it gives us a sense of the relationship between the home and romantic prospects in the novel. So Mr. Elton, you may remember, is the clergyman who Emma persuades Harriet to fall in love with, but who is himself in love with Emma. And when Emma's thinking of matchmaking, she says to her father, "Only one more match, Papa, only for Mr. Elton." "Poor Mr. Elton. You like Mr. Elton, Papa. I must look about for a wife for him. There is nobody in Highbury who deserves him, and he has been here a whole year and has fitted up his house so comfortably that it would be a shame to have him single any longer. And I thought when he was joining their hands, the hands of Mr. Weston and Miss Taylor, today, he looked so very much as if he would like to have the same kind office done for him." Now, I think this is a slight joke by Jane Austen in this first chapter, because she talks about how Mr. Elton has fitted up his house so comfortably. So a suggestion that essentially he's made it ready for a wife to inhabit. He's ready for matrimony. But comfortable is, of course, the same word that's used about Emma and her own home, that she has a comfortable home. And I think the repetition of this word comfortable in relation to a home twice in one chapter should make us as readers ready to spot that Mr. Elton thinks that his comfortable home is a comfortable home for Emma, that he's falling in love with Emma, even though Emma herself can't see it. So it's a little clue for the discerning reader. And Harriet, in falling in love with Mr. Elton, is also fixated on his house. When she sees it, she says, "Oh, what a sweet house, how very beautiful. There are the yellow curtains that Miss Nash admires so much." And so there's this sense that all the young ladies in the neighbourhood who have crushes on the handsome young clergyman are sort of associating the house with the clergyman, and they're using talking about the house as a way of expressing their desire for him. So Miss Nash and Harriet are admiring the yellow curtains, partly because they're imagining themselves as the mistress of this house, where they could enjoy the curtains themselves. Those of you familiar with Sense and Sensibility might remember that Marianne goes around a house with Willoughby, imagining how they would fit it up if they were married and living there. And so this is that kind of idea. These young women are imagining themselves into the house. But Mr. Elton's house also becomes important in relation to a different romance, and that is the false and deceptive romance of Frank Churchill and Emma, when Frank is trying to convince Emma that he's paying court to her to hide or to draw attention away from his secret engagement to Jane Fairfax. So we read, "She, Emma, was particularly struck by his manner of considering Mr. Elton's house, which, as well as the church, he would go and look at, and would not join them in finding much fault with. If it were to be shared with the woman he loved, he could not think any man to be pitied for having that house. There must be ample room in it for every real comfort. The man must be a blockhead who wanted more." Mrs. Weston laughed and said he did not know what he was talking about, used only to a large house himself, and without ever thinking how many advantages and accommodations were attached to its size, he could be no judge of the privations inevitably belonging to a small one. So here, as I mentioned earlier, is that tension between the house as a place you can be with someone you love, which is what Frank Churchill is thinking of because of his thwarted secret engagement, and the practical arrangements of a house. The fact that a house that is smaller than someone else's house can have inconveniences. The fact that the rich man who's used to a large house can't necessarily imagine himself into the small house when he's fantasizing about a marital couple living there. And the question of whether a house is the space and the architecture, or a house is the love that happens within it, or the relationships that happen within it, is a tension that Austen is playing with throughout this novel. And Frank Churchill, in fact, knows very much what other people feel about houses, and uses this to get his own way in the novel. So when he's arriving at last at Highbury to pay the long-postponed visit to his father, Mr. Weston, and his new stepmother, Emma's former governess, he spent much too long away when he should have been paying the visit. And in fact, the only reason he's paying the visit now is because he wants to see Jane Fairfax, who he's secretly engaged to. But he hides this by trying to suggest that he's able to be informal in paying his visit because he's coming home. So he arrives at Mr. Weston's house much earlier than he's expected, and he says that arriving like this is a great pleasure where one can indulge in it, though there are not many houses that I should presume on so far, but in coming home I felt I might do anything. The word home made his father look on him with fresh complacency. Emma was directly sure that he knew how to make himself agreeable. The conviction was strengthened by what followed. And this is slightly ironic understatement, particularly for the reader who's read this once before and knows what Frank is doing here. He certainly knows how to make himself agreeable. In fact, he's manipulating his father. He's using the fact that he's always lived, or for many, many years, lived away from his father, and the fact that his home isn't with his father, to make the fact that he calls his father's house his home really loaded and significant, to make his father and his new stepmother overlook everything else. And so again, there's that tension between house and home that I mentioned, being exploited by Frank to help him keep his secret, in the hope that he'll be able one day to have a home with the woman he loves. And while I'm talking about how all these different characters engage with the idea of the home, I can't do that without mentioning a minor character whose views offer a sort of odd mirror of Mr. Woodhouse's views. And this is Mr. John Knightley, the brother of the famous Mr. Knightley with whom Emma falls in love, who happens to be married to Emma's sister. And because he's a relatively minor character, he often doesn't appear in film adaptations, although he did appear very comically in the 2020 adaptation of Emma. And Mr. John Knightley, when he is forced out of the house where he's staying, so his father-in-law's house, Mr. Woodhouse's house at Hartfield, in order to be a guest at a Christmas party, feels this as a huge injustice because he prefers to stay at home. And so he has a long rant about this, which I'm actually going to read because it's so relevant to this talk. He says, "A man must have a very good opinion of himself when he asks people to leave their own fireside and encounter such a day as this," so a day of bad weather, "for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. It is the greatest absurdity, actually snowing at this moment. The folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out on such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, in defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man in everything given to his view or his feelings, to stay at home himself and keep all under shelter that he can. Here we are, setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or to hear that was not said or heard yesterday, and may not be said or heard again tomorrow, going in dismal weather to return probably in worse, 4 horses and 4 servants taken out for nothing but to convey 5 idle shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home." So I thought that whole rant was worth reading, because it's a similar sentiment to that of Mr. Woodhouse, this desire to stay at home, to not go into the outside world. And of course Mr. Knightley is coming at it from a slightly different position, because he has his wife and children at home, and so he has his kind of family unit where he feels he gets his society, and he's already a guest at someone else's house, having to then go out to a party. And we could say in modern parlance that Mr. John Knightley is definitely an introvert, while the man who has invited him, Mr. Weston, is a sociable extrovert who enjoys other people's company. And we get this tension here. But we also get a very entertaining exploration of the idea that the home is the place that you should want to be, because it's a place that shelters you from storms, it shelters you from weather. So those of you who saw my King Lear video in the Stay at Home Shakespeare series will recognise some of these ideas. And the thought that actually having to go outside into the outside world is a sort of dangerous encounter. But what's comic for Mr. Knightley ends up not being particularly comic for Mr. Woodhouse, because of the way, as I've hinted, that it circumscribes and holds back Emma, so that home becomes something almost closer to a trap or a prison. And I find it interesting that less than a decade after Emma was published, a song called Home Sweet Home became very popular. And it's a song that I'm not going to sing all of, I promise, but the essential moral of it is that even though palaces are wonderful places to wander around, in fact, if you've got your home, even if it's small, even if it's humble, even if it's a cottage, there's still no place like home. And then the chorus goes, "Home, home, sweet, sweet home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. So please excuse my bad singing there, but hopefully that gave you an idea of this is a song that essentially idealises the home, that suggests that the home is the only place to be. And so I find it's really interesting that it was popular just a few years after Emma. And of course this is the idea there's no place like home being popularised long before Dorothy clicked her ruby slippers together in The Wizard of Oz.
There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
And what's interesting about this is that you could argue that most of the characters in Emma are singing There's No Place Like Home, particularly characters like Mr. Knightley or Mr. Woodhouse, sorry I should say Mr. John Knightley as I've mentioned, or Mr. Woodhouse, but also characters like, for example, Harriet, who when she goes to stay with the Martins falls in love with their home, with its parlours and its summer house.
The only other people I know here are the Martins of Abbey Mill Farm. Mrs. Martin had 2 parlours and an oven maid and 8 cows. Mr. Martin used to cut fresh flowers every day.
How lucky for Mrs. Martin to have such an agreeable husband.
Oh, Miss Woodhouse, Mr. Martin is not her husband. He is her son.
Ah, I see.
Or, to give another example, Mrs. Elton, who eventually marries Mr. Elton, who's always talking about the home she's left behind, the home of her brother-in-law, Maple Grove. But the novel seems to be asking, is there no place like home? Should the home always be idealised? Or are there times when the home can become a problem, which is exactly what happens for Emma? Because near the end of the novel, when she's realised she's fallen in love with Mr. Knightley, there's a sense that she can't leave her home and she can't leave her father in order to marry and be with the man she loves. And we know that she loves Mr. Knightley when she visits his home, which is Donwell, because the narrator writes about it, the house was larger than Hartfield and totally unlike it, covering a good deal of ground, rambling and irregular, with many comfortable and 1 or 2 handsome rooms. It was just what it ought to be, and looked what it was, and Emma felt an increasing respect for it, as the residence of a family of such true gentility. And again we get just a little bit of that free indirect discourse, a little bit of the character's thoughts creeping in, because when she talks about the family of such true gentility, you get a sense of how in love with Mr. Knightley she's becoming. And that line, it was just what it ought to be and looked what it was, is quite playful on Austen's part, because that's true of Mr. Knightley, he is as he appears to be, and it's not true of the man who's been leading Emma astray, Frank Churchill, who appears to be one thing and is in fact another. So if you've seen video 2 of this series, you'll have seen Jessica Voles talking about how the Austen heroine often falls in love with a man through a portrait or through architecture, and here Emma is falling in love through architecture. But of course, when it comes to the proposal, Emma has to tell Mr. Knightley that she can't live with him at Donwell. And then we read, he had been thinking it over most deeply, most intently. He had at first hoped to induce Mr. Woodhouse to remove with her to Donwell. He had wanted to believe it feasible, but his knowledge of Mr. Woodhouse would not suffer him to deceive himself long. And now he confessed his persuasion that such a transplantation would be a risk of her father's comfort, perhaps even of his life, which must not be hazarded. So this is no place like home taken to extremes. If Mr. Woodhouse moves house, they worry that he might die. Mr. Knightley continues to think, Mr. Woodhouse taken from Hartfield? No, he felt that it ought not to be attempted. But the plan which had arisen on the sacrifice of this, he trusted his dearest Emma would not find in any respect objectionable. It was that he should be received at Hartfield, that so long as her father's happiness, in other words his life, required Hartfield to continue her home, it should be his likewise. So there might be no place like home, but here Mr. Knightley can't stay in his home. If he wants to be with the woman he loves, he has to move to Hartfield. And the ironic thing is that the only way that Mr. Knightley and Emma find to persuade Mr. Woodhouse of this is to convince him that the world outside the home is even more unsafe, that there are ruffians and robbers about, and that it would be much safer if Mr. Knightley, as another man, were to move into the house. So they have to sort of collude in this idea of the world outside as difficult and dangerous, and the home as the only place of safety, in order to ensure that they can love each other and actually make that house, Hartfield, a home in being a married couple together there with Mr. Woodhouse. So that's the end of today's video. If you want to join me again next week, I'm very excited to be talking to Samantha Lynn about her amazing role-play mobile phone game, Regency Love, which is inspired by Austen and lets you step inside the Regency world, and I'm slightly obsessed by it. So please join me to hear all about that at next week's At Home with Austen.